Good morning. It's a great pleasure to host this webinar series, Brazil and GPA WTO. I'm very glad to be the host of this panel. It makes part of this webinar series. It's coordinated by Professors Marçal Justin Filho, Sue Aerosmith, and Cesar Pereira. My name is Juliana de Palma. I'm a professor of administrative law at Getúlio Vargas Foundation, FGV. This panel treats the specific topic of accession and negotiation, what to expect. I'm extremely pleased to introduce our guests. So I'm going to introduce each of one in the order of talk. So first we have Astghik Solomanyan. I'm extremely glad to meet you. She is consultant for the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, GPO Technical Cooperation Facility. Welcome. She's going to basically teach us an overview of the process. Second to talk is Professor Ping Wang. He's professor of law at University of Nottingham, and he has a well-dressed agenda, research agenda on the procurement, public procurement issue. Third, we have Cesar Pereira. He's one of the coordinators of this webinar. He's going to talk about expectations and concerns as Brazil enters in this process. He is professor at IDP, Instituto Brasiliense de Direito Público, which is hosting this webinar. And he's partnered at Justin Pereira Oliveira and Talamini, a Brazilian law firm specialized on public procurement. I'm extremely glad to have you all here today, and thank you for acceptance of the invitation. Each one will have approximately 20 minutes to talk about the primary issue. After that, I'm going to conduct questions, and I truly invite the audience for two things. The first thing is to follow our webinar. It's extremely important, so it's well coordinated. We have 10 talks, and this is the third. So I strongly invite you to check the precedent one, the first and the second, at the IDP channel on YouTube, and also to follow the next. So every Thursday at 11 a.m. Brazilian time, we have a very important panel on the issue of the GPA. So I strongly invite you to follow this series of webinars. And secondly, I invite the audience to make questions to address concerns and suggestions for us. You can make this by chat or by QA, all right? So thank you very much. I'm going to start this talk. So Ping Wang, you have, no, sorry, Astghik, you have the floor. Thank you very much.
Astghik, I think your mic is muted.
You're muted. I'm sorry, Astghik. You need to, yeah, the microphone.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
Technical issues. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you. So, before starting, I'd like to thank the University of Nottingham and our Brazilian colleagues for the invitation and for the opportunity to talk today. And today, I am going to talk about the process and some practicalities, right? I'm going to lay the ground for our next panelists to continue and to build upon. And I'm going to give you a couple of practicalities on the accession and the negotiation process. Now, just to start with, let's talk about the current state of play, what we have in here. Now, we have, the first thing is who can join the GPA, right? So any WTO party can join. This means that if you're a country that still hasn't joined the WTO, you need to wait for it, right? You need to first join the WTO and then try to join the GPA. Now we have a curious case of Belarus that is still negotiating its WTO accession terms and getting the observer status. So not a full party to the GPA, but an observer to the GPA. So for the full party, you need to be a member of the WTO. Currently, we have 20 parties covering 48 states, including the European Union, with its 27 member states, Canada, United States, Japan, South Korea. And I want to mention the case of United Kingdom because we all know Brexit, and we all know that the European Union and the United Kingdom already managed to sign the withdrawal agreement. And what this means that the withdrawal agreement has a transition period which ends, well, the end of this year, pretty much. And during this period, we consider United Kingdom as the member state of the European Union. And after that, the United Kingdom is currently seeking to accede to the revised GPA right after the transition period ends. So right after the transition period, United Kingdom seeks to accede on its own right. We also have 35 observers, and these are countries including Argentina, Chile, Colombia, Ecuador, so loads of Latin American countries. And of course, Brazil is the one that is kind of taking a step forward by thinking of starting negotiations. In the process of negotiations, so countries that are now trying to accede, we have 12 states, including Russian Federation that might interest Brazil because they are in the BRIC, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyz Republic. These countries are trying to actively negotiate. What do you have to remember before the negotiation starts? And this is important to remember because this is the preparatory stage. First things first, gain political approval. This is important. Having your government behind your back is important for smooth negotiation process. And coming from Armenia, I think I can bring the example of Armenia, where we had a presidential order specifically laying down a decision to actually accede to the GPA. After that, there was a government decision laying down specific deadlines and steps to consider, which actually made the whole government to move in the same direction. So this is important. Second, prepare a negotiation strategy. Have an overview of what you would like to achieve. Have an overview of the time that you are given or you think you will need for the accession. Think of steps you need to take in order to accede. Then have a negotiation team. And this is also super important, not an ad hoc team of people that randomly come in and go out, but a team that is actually devoted to the GPA negotiations, right? That is there from point A to point Z, that understands the process and is fully involved and engaged. Have a team leader, a chief negotiator who will be skilled in trade negotiations and will understand procurement, because procurement is a very separate and quite particular topic of trade. Have a budget in place, and by this I mean to cover direct costs. I think Rob mentioned during the previous session that there might be direct costs involved with the negotiations, related to accommodation costs, travel to Geneva for the negotiations. I assume for Brazil, this will not be a big issue, right? But just have in mind that you might need to have some budget prepared to fly your delegation to Geneva, and know the data. This is the last point, but not the least one. We are talking about data so many times, especially recently, and knowing the data is important not only for data-driven policy choices, but first things first, for Brazil to understand its own procurement market. What is going on within the country for yourself to understand first, and second, you might get questions during the negotiations from the other parties related to data. So having it at hand will be also very helpful. Now, also try to answer these questions before moving forward with negotiations. What do you want to achieve with these negotiations? The idea is smooth, nice accession to the GPA, right? So have this as a target. How much of market do you want to cover? We know that GPA covers only part of the market, and you need to decide for yourself how much of it you would like to cover since the beginning. Then how much of time do you have to conclude the negotiations? Again, it depends, of course, on the exceeding country, on the negotiating parties, but having some kind of timeline in your head is important. Maybe you have a government decision telling you exceeding 3 years. Then you know you have the timeline and you can prepare. Then think sector by sector. Are there specific sectors you want to exclude? Is there anything sensitive that you definitely not want to cover by the GPA? Have this in mind as well. And then try to understand, even at this stage, how compliant is your national legislation with the GPA legislation, GPA requirements. And by legislation, I mean not only public procurement law, but the whole legislation related to procurement, right? Have a person, a lawyer, to understand the national legislation, to look at the GPA and to map the gaps and maybe possible amendments that Brazil might need to actually undertake in order to be compliant with the GPA. Now, this is the process at a glance, right? So the first step is to gain observer status, which Brazil already has, then answer the question of the checklist and tabling the first coverage offer. And by the way, there is no specific sequence of these stages, right? So you might first table the first coverage offer and then answer the checklist. You might do this simultaneously, or first the checklist, then the coverage offer. It depends on the country's wish, but you need to have, both at the same stage. After this, there are rounds of negotiations, and usually these are informal bilateral negotiations where you get asked questions for both, for the checklist, for your national legislation, and also related to your coverage offer. After the negotiations are over, and again, this might take years, or just 2 or 3, again, it depends. You will be asked to actually table the final offer, and if the parties to the GPA are fine with everything, you will be then invited to join the GPA. Now, 2 core issues to consider when you're thinking of joining the GPA. First, again, the compliance with the GPA. So answering the checklist questions and the main questions related to the principles of non-discrimination. You need to describe your whole procedures and processes that you have, what kind of review body you have, and it's a quite comprehensive checklist. And you might actually need to submit also your national legislation for the parties to understand themselves, right? To have an understanding of the Brazilian system. Then you answer questions from the parties, and you might need to amend parts of your legislation. Now, this sounds a bit scary because I know that internally changing legislation might be quite burdensome issue. You need to go through internal processes, get the approval of the parliament, but GPA is a flexible tool, right? So usually countries are already more or less compliant. So there might be some issues that needs to be amended, changed, etc. But overall, if I'm looking at several country national legislations, you're more or less compliant because the basic principle of transparency and usual non-discrimination is to be found in almost all national legislations. An important thing to remember here is that compliance with the GPA is mandatory before the agreement enters into force for that specific country, right? So you have all the period of negotiations to make your legislation compliant with the GPA. The second core issue to consider is the coverage offer. Again, what entities you're covering, what you are covering, are there any exemptions? And also how much of it you are covering, and that's the thresholds. So usually you will think of 7 annexes. Israel has 8, but it's like an offset note, so it's not the standard. Standard is 7 annexes. You might need to think about Annex 1, central government entities. And if you're looking at other annexes, you see that central government entities are usually covered very comprehensively. Sub-central government entities, so local government entities. Not all GPA parties cover all of their sub-central entities, but we see some improvements with the revised GPA, specifically with Canada covering a lot of sub-central entities. And the third is other entities. Now, You will not find any definition of other entities in the GPA text, and it differs. It depends pretty much on the institutional structure, economic structure of the country, right? So you might find utilities covered, you might find state-owned entities covered, so it depends per country. Now, what you are covering, you need to reflect these in annexes 4, 5, and 6. Goods, and usually the goods are covered in positive list, so you specifically list what is covered. Services, mostly covered through negative list, so you cover everything except for the listed services. And you cover in Annex 6 construction services, usually at the CPC 5051 level. And the 7th annex is about exemptions, general notes, right? So derogations per country, derogations per sector, and look at it as a balancing tool. If one country does not open a sector to you, you might actually want in your 7th annex, in the general notes, specifically mention that you also have some derogations related to this country and this sector. Now, I would like to invite you, I will put a link in the Q&A. You would like to have a look at the eGPA website. It's a very nice tool where you can actually have a look at all the annexes that all the other countries and parties are suggesting to have an understanding, right, of the structure, of what the others are covering, because let's not forget that GPA is based on reciprocity, right? Which means that you offer and I offer, and then we see if our offers are equivalent or not. And the final point is how much do I cover? So GPA affects procurement above specific sectors. These are the general thresholds that, depending on the entity, differs: goods, services, and construction services. And again, let's remember about reciprocity. You can try to negotiate higher thresholds, but you might actually expect also some, well, maybe resistance from other countries, and maybe the other countries would also like to have some, to increase their thresholds for you based on the reciprocity. Now, let's remember that. And this is usually what I think majority of the countries are covering in terms of thresholds. The concluding remarks that I would like you to have it as a takeaway from my talk is, first, the win-win outcome of negotiations is the best and is possible in the GPA, right? You don't have to give up a lot and not receive anything. There is a reciprocity. There is always a possibility to reach a win-win outcome. Second, the WTO Secretariat can provide a technical assistance to you. Right, so if you are struggling with understanding how GPA works, how to proceed with annexes, etc., you can ask the WTO Secretariat for technical assistance, and they are organizing both national and regional conferences to help the countries. And also have a look at the annexes of the parties, because again, you might be asked to provide equivalent coverage. Okay. And thank you for listening to me. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Astghik, for this very, very interesting presentation. I think we have a lot of precious information regarding the process and negotiation. It's well clarified. In an overview approach, it's brilliant, and it provides us a lot of insights to keep a record of our internal problems. I mean, at least for me, the main point of your talk is about negotiation and strategy. And you should have this backstage in our hometown and really track all the problems and the potentials regarding this acceptance and accession to GPA procedure. Therefore, thank you very much. I have a lot of questions precisely, and including the review board. We can explore this a little bit better later. So thank you very much. And I invite Wang to talk to us. Thank you.
Hi, thank you, Juliana. Can I have my slides up, please? Emily, thank you. Hi, everyone. Nice to talk to you today. Thank you to Juliana and to Cesar to invite me to speak at this webinar. It's a great pleasure and good timing, though, actually, to talk about China's accession to the WTO GPA. So today I'm going to talk about 20 minutes to cover the experience so far, and then look into the crystal ball at the very end to talk about the prospect of China join the GPA soon. All right, we'll see how that will be. So as Juliana introduced, that I'm actually assistant professor, not professor yet, in law at the University of Nottingham, and I work for the Public Procurement Research Group as deputy director for quite a long time. And I have the pleasure to see some of my, our PhD students actually, flourish in the field, including Astghik. And we're very proud, and we wish you all the best for the future as well. And so without further ado, I'll start my presentation. I'll show you the outline. So next slide, please. So today I'm going to give you an overview of China's GPA accession that will may actually provide some kind of lessons for the Brazilian audience. And then I'm going to talk a little bit more about the benefits and costs. I'm pretty sure that in the first webinar where Robert Anderson has talked about this, he has emphasized a lot of the benefits of joining the GPA, but from Chinese perspective, and also from a developing country, including like Brazil and other BRICS countries and even least developing countries. So we'll see whether or not that the benefits going to pan out and what will be the cost. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the developing country special and differential treatment, which is very relevant to both China and Brazil. And to talk a little bit about the way forward, how we're going to proceed and when we're going to conclude. So I will start with the overview of China's GPA accession. This is the story. All right, next slide, please. Okay, I said this is a long march, and I used to put this just long march there, and now I say long march close to its end, because the most recent offer is actually provide some hope, a silver lining. If you say that we have seen the end of the tunnel, and we see the light. Right? So China actually, when China joined the WTO, and all of the major parties of the GPA and WTO, including the US and the EU, they insisted that China join the GPA at the same time. So China managed to dodge the bullet at that point. So saying that we're gonna join the GPA as soon as possible. That was actually in 2002. So how long is as soon as possible? 2007. So 5 years in the Chinese scale. Maybe because we are Asian civilization, have 1,000 years of history. So 5 years is already soon for us, all right? So the initial offer of China actually tabled in December 2007. And then the checklist of issues, actually, that's what we call the report of the national status, is actually tabled at in 2008. So afterwards, obviously, the initial offer is quite limited. The coverage of central entities is actually good, but then the coverage of sub-central entities and the Annex 3 entities, especially state-owned enterprises, is actually not very satisfactory. So China tabled a series of revised offers. You can see the timing there. From 2010, that's July, and then 2011, 12, 13, and 14, all in December, right before Christmas. So we always just say this is actually Santa Claus, like to give you a present just before Christmas, something you take home with too. However, you can see the gap between 2014 and 2019. There's a 5-year gap, all right? That gap is not a long gap, again, taking into consideration of 1,000 years of civilization and history. But then again, it's quite actually noticeable. Why? Because the whole context has changed, and then the internal momentum to join the GPA has actually dried out at a point. Without any further kind of push from the top leadership, it will be impossible for China to move forward. And on the side, the external factor is the trade war between China and the US actually ignites at that point. Right after Donald Trump actually got into power. Hopefully we can get rid of him by November. We don't know. So, however, the things changed in 2018, where President Xi Jinping, the #1 in China, actually said that, okay, China will join the GPA at the Boao Forum, his opening speech. He mentioned only a few things, but GPA is one of them. He said that China is going to join the GPA as soon as possible. All right, so that is actually a divine interference, if you say, in China. The emperor has finally spoken. So then China will actually move forward. So after that, the Chinese negotiator used this as a mandate, they actually start initiating all of the questionnaire to ask local government and all the SOEs to cooperate. All right, now you have no excuse because number one has said so. And then they have made a lot of improvement. So the October 2019 offer, this is the sixth revised offer, the current offer, is actually now cover all central entities, including the PLA, that's the People's Liberation Army. The Ministry of Defense is actually, just a front. But then the PLA-LH, that's the logistic headquarters, they're actually buying all of the dual purpose goods for both the military and for civilian purposes. So they have been included. Obviously, the goods they procure, which is listed, is still limited, but nevertheless, the defense procurement could be covered. And then all provincial entities, that's including all the provincial governments, except only maybe 3 or 4 of the autonomous regions, which is actually really backwards, don't spend a lot of money like Tibet. All construction services, yeah, this is a negative list, no longer a positive list. So it's very good, improvement, and also 37 public utility still enterprises. The last offer, if you just compare the number, the last offer in 2014, how many SOEs we have? 3, and now you have 37. So that's a big push forward and big leap. Right? So that's why I said we are almost there. So this is the overview. I'm hopeful, we can conclude it, in a reasonable time. The last slides I'm going to talk about, to what extent we're still facing some of the remaining obstacles, and those remaining obstacles will be a lesson for Brazil. So think about in the future, if you start negotiation, and then if you table your initial offer, how to avoid all of the inquiries for all of the existing GPA parties with regard to all of the missing gaps in those annexes, which China has actually faced in the past 13 years. So if you're capable of covering gaps from the very beginning, or to delete some of the derogations which is not necessary to you, then do it at the very beginning. Then you're going to save a lot of time and effort, and save a lot of time to talk to people. Right? So at the end of the first slides, I have to also talk about the big issues remains. So that's the hint of what we're going to say at the last slides. Trade war with the US, war deal, derogations, special differential treatment for developing countries, compliance issue, and so on and so forth. Those things, some of them I will cover, across the slides. So, all right, next slide, please. Okay, so just a reminder of the benefits. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. This is actually a promotion on behalf of my friend Robert Anderson. So, according to their statistics gathered by Robert, predominantly when he was at the Secretariat, $1.6 trillion US, a big market. All right. However, you need to check that the data on actual contract awards supplies from other GPA parties, that including Brazil. Actually, EU actually produced some of the useful reports to say that how much the percentage of the EU contract awarded to third countries, and to cross-border trade, that's predominantly for the EU itself, to say to keep an eye on the cross-border trade. And then you'll realize the majority of the contract awarded to suppliers from other member states in terms of public procurement, like 88% or more. And then for the other GPA parties, you will realize actually it's not only less than 1%, even to US, for example. Right? And that is something we need to actually, to take into consideration. However, each country has their own strength. As Astghik has pointed out, you need to gather the data. You need to solicit all of the opinions from all of the industrial sectors. This is what Chinese government, the negotiator, has done, the Ministry of Finance. So this issues questionnaire to all of the sector ministries and all of the industrial associations to ask them, what do you want out of this deal? So you need to ask what you really want to gain, which type of contract you have been denied access. Now with the membership of GPA, you will gain access to. Right? In terms of the EU, obviously, they do not have a bi-European regulation yet. Right? I will mention later on, they will have one probably in the future, but they do not have one. But bi-American Act is always there. Right? Okay. So check the data, both domestically and internationally. Next slide, please. So market access opportunities as the benefit to GDPA. The second aspect, another aspect is to avoid the trade barrier regarding public procurement. A number of countries put in, binational provisions in their national procurement rule. That's predominantly, the biggest example is the US, but also EU has proposed a third country access to the public procurement market regulation. It still remains a draft at the moment, but then the EU Commission has actually rolled out a number of kind of soft law guidance with regard to how to actually put up the fence to encourage people to join the GPA. Obviously, that will actually affect a number of countries with export oriented, including China and India and Brazil and South Africa, all of the BRICS countries and other developing countries. However, I will ask you this, that do you think that the GPA membership will guarantee market access or guarantee you're going to overcome all the trade barriers? Okay, don't be naive. The report is that it's not, because a number of issues will not be covered by the GPA because, for example, US, the Little Barrier American Act, as I mentioned there, is actually not covered by the GPA, right? So if you want to know what the Little Barrier American Act is, you can send an email to me. I'll send you my report, which I've written for the EU, assessing all of the trade barriers. Right? And also the EU has complied numerously in the past to the US about the operation of the Barrier American Act. In their federal acquisition regulation, there's only one provision there saying that all the GPA parties, that's what I'm translating basically, all the GPA party suppliers, they will not be affected by the Barrier American Act. There's one provision there. But then how on earth a procurement official operating in one of the states of the US, see how they manage the coronavirus, how they understand how they will be able to comply with that one provision in the fall. Right? It's actually difficult to see. This is not my observation, by the way. This is an observation by Golden, which is one of the professors from George Washington University, which is located in the US, and he used to actually work for the GAO, the Government Accountability Office, which is advising the president about the public procurement policy. And he worried about the implementation or the enforcement of the GPA in the US soil. Right? So would they guarantee market access? Think twice. Another thing which I mentioned there, okay, this is going to attract attention of some kind of unwanted attention maybe from non-academic circles. Okay, the lingering shadow of US restrictions on national security. Now it's not only the US restriction. Last night the BBC reported that the UK has stripped from its 5G network of all of the Huawei component, because of the US complaint, because US pressure. So even if China joined the GPA, it would not actually stop US or prevent US and the UK from actually denying the firm like Huawei or other firms I mentioned on my slide, like ZTE, Sanye, and Rose, to provide some of the goods and services, which is actually from any point of view, it's probably civilian actually purpose or for due purpose at the best, because the basic telecommunication network, it could be used for military purpose. You can actually arguably to say that, okay, this is actually related to national security, to intelligence gathering. However, this is a dangerous precedent because China can do the same after joining the GPA with regard to Microsoft, for example, or the other technical giants from the US. The interpretation of the GPA Article 3. Article 3 of the GPA, the current version, contains a national security derogation exception there. It's a built-in mechanism. But for us, as a lawyer, we have to think about this as a nuclear weapon. This is the last resort. Until you actually back to the point where you say, okay, I really don't care about the treaty relationship between the two countries. You will not actually resort to that particular national security exception. That will really jeopardize the future relationship between the two trading nations, as we have seen now between China and the US, and then presumably will be between China and the UK in the future, obviously with Hong Kong in the background. I used to work for the Hong Kong and Macau Affairs Office of the Chinese government, so Hong Kong used to be my turf, so is Macau. But this is actually another life, so I'm forbidden by Official Secret Act, the Chinese equivalent, to speak about Hong Kong. But that is another kind of precursor and the context why UK actually take this particular action now. Next slide, please. So how much time I have left, Juliana? I tend to overrun sometimes. Just could you tell me how many minutes I have left?
You have 3 minutes, more or less.
3 minutes. Okay. All right.
Make a point.
Okay. All right. So the benefit of GPA, the domestic reform, is another thing which is a lot of people actually overlooked. To say, okay, not only to gain contract from abroad, but also the GPA can actually entrench the position of your domestic reformers, especially with regard to the procurement law. I'm not going to go into the detail of the Chinese procurement regime. I'm writing my book on it, so hopefully you can read afterwards. But quite a lot of things the GPA can do. And with the big hope of the Chinese academics and the Chinese reformers, we're hoping that the GPA can be used as an incentive or momentum to help to harmonize the domestic legal framework, which at the moment is fragmented. Okay. Next slide, please. So a number of things, because we are facing a lot of corruption in China. All right, I'm not quite sure. I'm not saying I'm to be, biased towards any other country, but I've seen some interesting Brazilian film about the police force. I think it's called Elite. Yeah, so I quite like the film, but I also kind of appreciate the degree or the extent of corruption that you're facing in the country, where we actually facing an institutional issue of corruption as well in China. So for that, actually, for the combat against corruption to work, procurement is only one of the tools. It's not the only tool, and it's not the most effective tool, but is one of the instruments that you can use. However, it will work best if you have external suppliers to participate, especially in terms of supplier review, because those domestic suppliers can be easily intimidated, but the foreign suppliers maybe not. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so GPA approach to the different type of horizontal and secondary policies. This is because that's one of the main concern of all of the countries join the GPA, is to say, to what extent we are free to actually pursue our secondary or horizontal policies in the future. So that means, for example, protect the environment, or to protect the social, values, to promote social values, and to promote the industrial policies, especially industrial policies. When they say, I want to, to help local development, I want to promote local brand. I understand that the Brazilian industry have several strengths, especially, for example, like the airlines. For example, the production of airplanes. Yeah, there's one particular documentary we have seen. I'm very impressed with the Brazilian industry for the airplanes. So those kind of things. Just remember that the GPA treat environmental protection differently from the rest. The environmental protection has received special attention in the text, that the Article 10, 6, and 9, and all the rest of them, like the social values, industrial policies, SMEs. They are not actually mentioned in the main text, but it could be covered by future work program on sustainable procurement and SMEs. Next slide, please. So for the discriminatory measures to exist, that means if you want to continue the practice to protect your national industry, including like airplane or any other, then you're going to have to do it in one of these 4 ways. So predominantly I'm going to talk about today is for developing countries to use such a measure as a transitional measure, maybe as an offset during a transitional period. Right? So, or you can negotiate a specific derogation, but that comes as a price. You're going to have to pay for it. Yeah, it's nothing comes for free. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so the developing countries special differential treatment under the GPA is Article 5. So first of all, you're going to have to make sure you are regarded as a developing country by the existing GPA party. That is no small matter. So basically, China has actually tried to claim, because there's no universal standard or threshold, or there's no independent or impartial third party to judge, to actually have a binding ruling like the DSCA to say you are a developing country or not. We hope there should be that kind of procedure, but there isn't. So anybody can claim themselves as a developing country in the context of the WTO, similarly in the context of GPA. So China tried to claim to be a developing country, obviously meet resistance from the US and from others predominantly. I understand from Cesar that he's going to talk about this with regard to Brazil in the Brazilian context as well. So it's no small issue. You're going to have to first pass this hurdle. And then secondly, all the special and differential treatment, they are not absolute. They're subject to negotiation. And also you have to make sure you make a case with regard to your specific needs. So as a developing country, you have to have a specific needs for that particular transitional measure or implementation period of specific obligation. Then you can start to negotiate. And then again, it's subject to the acceptance of all the other GPA parties. It's not going to come as a free ride or free gift. So as long as I have the badge of developing country, I got all of this for free. No, it's not. You're going to have to negotiate for it. And it's quite hard. Part of the reason is because the GPA parties themselves, they are not very experienced actually in handling this, because the GPA new text is actually coming in 2012. And before that, they have not actually handled any developing country yet. And then afterwards, obviously, they have the experience with Israel, which is claiming itself as a developing country, but a lot of people think they are not. And obviously, they handle Moldova. That's another issue. So the main differential treatment, special differential treatment under the GPA, one of them is implementation period. The length is specified. So for the least developing country, you can have up to 5 years. That's a UN list of ILDT, which China and Brazil won't be on it. And then for other developing countries, not exceeding 3 years. Yeah, can be extended, but very difficult. Transitional period. So transitional period, the length is not specified actually in the text itself. It could be long or could be short. It could be 2-3 years. It could be long, because I've been told by my deputy friend that in the past that Jordan was negotiating 15 years. And then Israel has also 15 years to phase out their SME preference measure, which is after the new round of negotiation. So it could be long, could be short. It depends on the negotiation. It's uncertain. So what you can do during the transitional period as a transitional measure, that's the domestic preference. You can actually favor your national products, but you're going to have to make sure that you comply with MFN. That means you cannot discriminate among other GPA parties. Right? So you can prefer your domestic products, but you have to make sure you make it transparent. And you can phase in addition of entities. You can have a higher threshold, to begin with, and then periodically reduce this threshold. That's what China has done in this new offer. And then offset. So offset, there's definition in the GPA itself. It's saying domestic content requirement, transfer of technology, and so on and so forth. Right? So in my chapter of my book, which I'm drafting at the moment, I'm almost finished, there's one particular chapter on China GPA accession, and I devoted a huge section actually on transfer of technology, because China actually relied on transfer of technology to gain its status as a workshop of this world as it is now. So we got transfer of technology from Germany, from the US, from France, from various places, including UK as well. So this is actually one thing which China will hold on to. And then it's true, actually, also with regards to the current offer, China saying that we will maintain to use offset. It mentioned transitional period separately, but also very specifically mentioned when we want to use offset. However, that thing needs to be think again, rethink. Yeah, we need to rethink this actually in the context of the deal, which is actually between China and the US. Can I have next slide, please? Okay, that's why I'm saying that we look into the crystal ball, because some of the context for offset, I just use this as an example, has changed. First of all, this year, January, the trade deal, the phase 1 trade deal between China and the US, they have a particular chapter dedicated to transfer of technology, where China actually undertake, that means we made a promise to the US that all the transfer of technology will be done on a voluntary and commercial basis. Right? Secondly, on the foreign investment law, we also mentioned, free technology transfer. And then in that context, the offset, especially with regards to transfer of technology, which we insist as a derogation in the GPA offer, it's become outdated, because you actually promised on the side one thing to the US, presumably that will be applicable to all the other GPA parties and WTO members as well. Why on earth you insist this, in the context of GPA? So this is a kind of coordination, because that promise, the trade deal, was predominantly it's another Chinese ministry in charge of this, that's Ministry of Commerce, that's the MOFCOM. And then the negotiator for the GPA is the Ministry of Finance. So obviously, when these two not talking to each other or not talking to each other closely, you can see there's some kind of discrepancies in terms of overall stance or overall policy of the country there. Okay. And other obstacles, including that, we have 37 SOEs, quite impressive, large SOEs, more than US has offered, right? However, we can still do more, right? There are other, utility firms like in the electricity, in telecommunication, our airlines, state-owned banks, all of the things they can mention. However, China can argue, for example, telecommunication firms, they actually operate in a liberalized market, like in the US, in the EU. Yeah, the EU does not offer its own telecommunication firms because telecommunication market itself has been liberalized. But in China, can you say so? Because we have 3 or 4 of the major firms, all state-owned, and then they probably only operate, from the competitional perspective, a oligopolistic market, not necessarily fully liberalized. Airlines, fully commercial. They are actually competing against each other vigorously, sometimes too much. They have driven the price of the air ticket really low, at sometimes below cost. It's almost like anti-dumping, if you have kind of anti-dumping within the territory. Okay, state-owned banks, similar story of kind of a very limited number of players, but nonetheless they're competing vigorously against each other. Would the invisible hand actually be sufficient to actually stop all discrimination? However, what doesn't do any favor to all the Chinese SOEs is that each time when Chinese president or Chinese premier visit any other country, they always take a bunch of entrepreneurs, presumably CEOs of all of the SOEs, to sign a bunch of deals during the visit to make sure that our relationship really flourish, because we have all of the business deal and trade going on. And then you will actually infer from that to say, okay, you're not really independent there. You are still influenced by the state because you have to sign a contract at that point. Okay, so that's just not the case. One of the major academic arguments which I've made in the past is to say that the China, each and every time we have major infrastructure projects, we actually establish a new SOE to procure this. So if you want to have a new highway, a new high-speed railway, we establish new SOE to procure this whole project. And then by definition, those new entities cannot be covered by the existing list of the GPA, which is actually for the entity coverage, it's still positive list, especially with regard to Annex 3. So that's the major issue there. Again, the remaining obstacle. Other general imprecise description of transitional period, because the Chinese offer at the moment is still restricted document. I cannot show you the text. But some of the derogations which we have done during in the text, I mentioned some of them with regard to offset, with regard to implementation, with regard to transitional period, they're not precisely worded. So that can be improved from the Brazilian perspective. When you draft your first offer, especially with regard to Annex 7, which is general notes, and also with respect to Annex 1 to 6, there's a note to each annex underneath. You have to take care. Do not put in anything that you don't really need. Okay, so China's practice has been, that's partially my fault when I actually first advised the Ministry of Finance in around actually 2006. We say, okay, we're going to sample all the existing derogations found in all other GPA parties offer in their Appendix 1. And then we're going to put it in the initial document where we're going to research on for our final offer, see which one we will need, or we can just put them all there to use as a card, as a leverage to negotiate it away. There's the pros and cons for this approach. The pro is actually to say that you have a lot actually to negotiate away, to give you something as a leverage. The cons is to demonstrate to the other GPA parties that you're not really serious. Yeah. So at that point, the China is to say we're going to fulfill this obligation, the promise we made that we're going to join the GPA, but we're not in a hurry. There's no domestic kind of push or momentum or incentive for us to join the GPA at that point. That has changed in the last decade or so because China now going abroad. We're actually pursuing all the export and international trade. We actually advocate win-win instead of all the Donald Trump saying about zero-sum game. So that has changed. So now for Brazil to do this, you have to think carefully, do you need this or not? As I mentioned, offset, transfer technology, do you need this? as I mentioned, SOE, derogation. Do you need it? China surely does not, because we have 76% of the procurement contract already awarded to the SOEs, and the SOE set aside, which is threshold is 33%. We're way past that. We don't really need this derogation. Okay. So external contact. Last point I want to make is, at this point, I have to ask the U.S. administration: do you want war, or do you want a deal? Because the way they're heading is actually towards a really kind of not only a cold war, but towards a hot war at the trade front, and then it can escalate to other things because they ask the UK to send its aircraft carrier to the South Pacific, to the South China Sea. That is something which is really kind of intimidating. All right, China is not a small force. It's not actually. This is not the 19th century, which you can use your warship to open our doors. It's no longer the case. All right, there's similar things with Hong Kong. Military pressure will not work. You have to engage China in kind of reasonable talk. So that's why I would say international trade negotiation, including the GPA accession negotiation, part of the big picture. We have to think about we live in a global village. We have to deal with each other peacefully and to find a solution. We always say the solution will be more than the questions and than the issues. So hopefully, at the end of the day, we can be reasonable. Yeah, we can all be reasonable and reach a deal instead of a war. Thank you very much for listening to me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ping. It was an amazing speech, actually. At least for Brazil, it's extremely important to get acquainted to experiences, and especially the Chinese experience, because we share so many features. For example, they struggle with corruption, and also the infrastructure projects that's going on here in Brazil, and they are huge projects. So it's extremely interesting because it's a time for us to anticipate the right questions. And on your speech, we could see what are the right questions in accordance to a reality, in accordance to a case, the Chinese case. So thank you very much for your speech. I'm sure you have time to explore the points that unfortunately we couldn't face now, especially the part of corruption and the tension between GPA and domestic framework. Thank you very much. Pereira, I invite you to talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Juliana. Well, let me just share my screen here. Okay. Well, first of all, wearing my hat as one of the organizers, I would like to thank Juliana Palma, thank Ping, Wang, and Astghik Solomanyan for accepting to be in this panel today. I think it's very remarkable that today's webinar, the topic that we're discussing today, is actually what makes this webinar series so timely for Brazil. Because what we are trying to focus on today is that this is a process that the accession of Brazil to this specific international agreement is different from what happens with other agreements in which we join something that's already there. Here we have a very clear negotiation process in that entails that the pros and cons of joining are dependent on that process. So in a way, it will be good or bad for Brazil to be part of the GPA, depending on how we handle this process. And so that's why it's so important to hear Astghik, to hear Ping, and share their experiences with this at the moment that we are preparing to initiate this process. Well, as you know, Brazil Brazil applied to join the GPA in May this year. Before that, it had already applied to be an observer with the GPA in 2017. Before that, Brazil had a very clear position against joining the GPA because it prioritized its relationships with other Latin American countries and government procurement agreements that were done regionally or bilaterally in that area. But after we became observers at the GPA, we started to become more involved. And as Astghik mentioned, the GPA Secretariat can supply technical support, and it actually did in Brazil. There was a seminar in Brasilia in May 2018, precisely to get the country ready for this accession process. The accession process in this case is that typical of a plurilateral agreement. So it's in the framework of the WTO, which is a multilateral agreement. But it depends on negotiations with each of the other parties to the GPA. And that's pretty much what Astghik and Ping were describing. There are two distinct aspects in this. The demonstration of the consistency of national legislation, and as Astghik mentioned, we can amend that legislation up to when the GPA will enter into force in Brazil, and also the negotiated coverage, and that is the key concept: coverage. As you probably understood from my colleagues, the GPA requirements and restrictions apply to covered procurement. And so the key element is what is covered, and that is subject to intense negotiation. When we prepare for the next steps, basically we want to understand what we want to gain and what we want to protect, because that's basically the focus of these negotiations. And then we don't need to rush. When we think of joining an international agreement, we may think that that's something that can happen quickly. Fast, in this case, means 3 years. If we look at the history of some of the countries that joined, it usually takes 3, 4, 5, sometimes even longer. Ping told us about the Chinese story with the GPA, and that started in the early 2000s when the first application was made. And even the first offer was already made more than 12 years ago. This is an extract from a GPA committee report describing the process that was done by Australia, which, as you can imagine, must have been a relatively simple process because, well, it is a developed country and it has a very structured legislation. And even in that case, there were at least 3 different offers. There were many comments on the checklist that had to be resolved, and the process took about 3 years. So my point is, we don't need to rush. We need to be prepared. We need to look at the data, as Astghik mentioned. We need to understand what we want. We need to use China's experience and maybe do not focus on things that are not needed. But we also need to be careful about how we present our first offer and understand that this is a first offer. There will be probably several others. There will be the opportunity to discuss what we need and what we will give in exchange for what we need. The first aspect, consistency of procurement practices, what's related with the checklist, in a way is easier, obviously, than the negotiated coverage. The basic structure of the GPA is something that if a Brazilian public procurement lawyer were to look at it, would find very familiar. As Astghik mentioned, basic structure of the requirements are pretty much what we are used to. There are even some things that we are very much used to, such as electronic procurement auctions, rules regarding transparency, integrity, the idea of non-discrimination. These are that's all there, and we will. Actually, one thing that a Brazilian lawyer would probably find interesting is that the GPA is able, in about 16, 18 articles, to say basically what we in Brazil take several different laws with tens or hundreds of articles to say. So it is an interesting exercise to look at the GPA and see how those things can be said much more directly and in a much more straightforward manner. The domestic review body, Juliana mentioned that. That's interesting because that is something that's a requirement, but it's in a way something that we are very much used to in Brazil. Well, we are. It is nothing new to have judicial review of administrative action in public procurement. And so the idea that we would need to have an administrative or judicial independent body to discuss compliance with the GPA is something that it wouldn't be anything very surprising for Brazil. One thing that would be new and very, very useful is the idea of actual procurement statistics, statistics that can be used and that can be understood in a comprehensive and systematic way. We do have lots of data that are put out there. Some of them are well processed. Some of them are impossible to understand and to process. And that is an area in which we will have to improve in joining the GPA. About clarity and transparency of the legislation and changes in legislation and practice, the GPA contains several requirements in that regard, but it's interesting to note that the GPA does not deal with what is probably our main problem, which is contract administration. Not only the tendering phase of procurement, but also how we deal with contracts. And it will be, I believe, very interesting to understand whether a domestic review body, for instance, would be able to judge whether an inadequate contract administration, for instance, lack of payment, delays by the government, things like that, would actually amount to violation of GPA requirements and guarantees. Moving to coverage, which is the main issue. As my colleagues mentioned, the GPA contains or provides for 7 annexes in which each country will set forth the coverage it intends to give to the other GPA members in its own public procurement market, and that is subject to basically negotiation. It will be very important for us to be mindful of what those annexes mean and what they can contain. Annex 1, that deals basically with central government, in our case, the federal government procurement, can describe certain restrictions and also can contain certain criteria that are important to us in terms of public policy instruments, small and medium enterprises, sustainability, things like that. But probably the points where we would have more trouble with moving forward in Brazil are those related to subcentral government entities, which means states and cities, and the SOEs, state-owned enterprises. We have, like the US, for instance, we have a great deal of public procurement in Brazil that's related to states, especially states, but also some large cities procurement. In that, it will need to be discussed, and that will need to be subject to consultations. In our first webinar here, Ambassador Norberto Moretti mentioned specifically that there is a process of internal consultations in order to prepare Brazil's offer, and it will be very important that subcentral entities will be involved in that process. About state-owned enterprises, maybe like China, like from what Ping Wang described, Brazil has a large portion of its public procurement related to state-owned enterprises. And these figures that you see here are some of the figures related to the federal state-owned enterprises only. But we also have a large number of SOEs in some of the states. In FGV, where Juliana Palma is from, where she teaches, has an observatory, an SOE observatory with some information. And I believe even they are not completely sure how many SOEs we have in Brazil. It's estimated to be about 500, but we're not really sure. So that's a problem we will need to discuss. Also, the other annexes, 4, 5, and 6, which relate to goods, services, and construction, and Annex 7 with the general notes that will create conditions that apply to the other annexes as well. They contain an interesting aspect also in Brazil, which is we rely a great deal on BOTs, concessions, PPPs in the provision of infrastructure services and in construction. And there must be a discussion on how that type of contract will be considered in our offers, especially with regard to the thresholds. How do we treat these thresholds, these limits, these financial limits for covered procurement with regard to those contracts, and whether we include contracts like that in our coverage or not. Before I move into my last topic here, I just wanted to point out something that Ambassador Parola mentioned in our first webinar as well. The GPA is the participation in the GPA is something in constant evolution. It's not set. It's not frozen in time. There is a commitment to an effort to reduce restrictions and further negotiations. And there are formalized procedures for modifications in coverage under the GPA. I think it's very, very important, as we understand these special concerns for the Brazilian market with regard to the GPA, that we focus on the necessary interaction between the government and the private sector. CNE, the National Industry Confederation, has already started this process years ago, In 2017, it issued a paper on public procurement agreements. In 2018, it issued a handbook, and it voices concerns and especially recommendations on how to go on with this involvement of Brazil with the GPA. And my last point is something that Ping mentioned regarding developing countries. As he mentioned, the GPA contains in Article 5 specific provisions regarding transition periods and a special differential treatment, STD, for developing countries. And it would seem only natural that Brazil is a developing country for that purpose. But the fact is that in March last year, in March 2019, the Brazilian government specifically stated its commitment to, and I quote, begin to forego special and differential treatment STD in World Trade Organization negotiations. And that has been even submitted formally to the WTO. So we now have a formal commitment. We have had that since last year, a formal commitment from Brazil not to take advantage of Article 5, or at least not to take advantage of special and differential treatment under WTO. Some of the questions that may arise about this specific commitment are whether that is applicable to plurilateral negotiations as well as to the multilateral framework of the WTO, whether the GPA, which is a treaty from the 1990s, revised in the early 2010s, whether that falls under this definition of future negotiations in the WTO, and whether the current policy that is adopted that has been adopted by Brazil is still consistent with this, let's say, to use this phrase, this post-pandemic world, right? In March 2019, we lived in a different world. We now live in somewhere that we don't really know what it is, right? And so I believe either from a legal standpoint or from a policy standpoint that Brazil needs to think about this position. But on the other hand, as we have already heard from my colleagues, the real effect of STD, of the special and differential treatment, may not go as far as one would think, because Ping made it very clear that we, even under Article 5, all those specific measures regarding developing countries must be negotiated. And so, in a way, it doesn't really make much of a difference if you have to negotiate these conditions from the starting point that you are a developing country, or simply as part of the negotiation as well. Well, the important thing is that in either situation, we need to be mindful that we are in a negotiation, and that we, if we are to play in the big league, we need to play like the big leaguers, and we need to know what we want to, and we need to know how to reach that. And that may also, and with this I finish, may also involve a combination of tools. The GPA is one instrument for facilitating government purchases and opening the market and creating good governance in that regard. But there are other tools as well, and the accession to the GPA can be combined with new bilateral treaties, regional agreements, and things like that. We are not only are we in a process with regard to the GPA, but GPA is also in the context of a bigger and more comprehensive position that Brazil has in the international arena. With this, I close, and I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Cesar. It's an amazing presentation. So the main point in your presentation, in my perspective, is that this process is not a formal process, a bureaucratic process, but it's extremely dynamic, and it's aimed to prepare a country, and in our case, Brazil, to decide in a more informed fashion. So thank you very much for bringing up what we need to consider in Brazilian perspective to achieve such a goal. So thank you very much. We have more or less 15 minutes for discussion. I have one question for each one of you guys, and if you allow me, I would be strict with the time, so maybe 3 minutes for each question, but it's a time for you to explore a little bit better important points of your presentation. So the first question is for Astghik. Thank you very much once again. Astghik, I would like to know a little bit about your view of what's a successful process of Accession. So I know that it's case-driven. I know that each country has its peculiarities, but what do you consider a successful process? And for us, it's something extraordinarily important. So if you could say on your view, what's the successful process and how we can achieve this in 3 minutes, you a very good speaker.
Then I need to be very quick. I guess from the GPA point of view, the success is when all the parties have what they wanted, right? So what they actually advocated for. And this is exactly what I want to cover and what I don't want to cover, right? It's about equivalence. It's about the balance. It's about the win-win situation. I guess the success is that. And also, I think from political point of view, the success would be considered that the process is smooth, because there are some cases where the country starts really, really in a nice way, and then something changes, then they stop, then they move again, then they stop. So I guess the success also from the GPA point of view could be the smooth and continuous negotiations, no matter how it takes. The idea is that the wheel is actually moving, you're moving forward, because again, it's a step-by-step process. You need to think of rounds of bilateral negotiations, right? So it's 3 to 4 meetings a year, and you just need to keep the wheel moving towards your final aim. I think this is the ideal negotiations, when there is no interruption, there is no stop whatsoever. You just, even if it's small steps, you just keep moving.
Right. Thank you very much. For Ping, I have I would like to give you time to explore the connection between corruption and GPA, which is something extraordinarily important. This is a very compelling issue in Brazil, and it's on the table of discussion. So if you could just framework a little bit better and explore this issue for us, I would be extremely grateful. Thank you.
Okay. All right, thank you. So, my friends and colleague, Mr. Robert Anderson, who used to work for the WTO Secretariat in charge of the GPA, he always mentioned that in his presentation that the new GPA has included a link to the UN Convention of Anti-Corruption, and then mentioned the conflict of interest. And these things, they are not new in the domestic procurement law. You can find it anywhere, including ancestral model law itself. But for international agreement, for the WTO agreement, it's actually the first time. So this is the kind of breakthrough. So the link between the corruption and the procurement law, we have always been appreciated by the academics across the world. In certain countries like China, like Turkey, presumably about Brazil, the first and foremost objective for a procurement law is actually to provide transparency, and then to provide a kind of more just and more open process for the government to spend its money. And as Cesar mentioned, one thing about the review body, about the court, is actually to make sure the government pays at the end, pay the suppliers on time. And that is one issue with regard to SMEs. They cannot survive if you keep hold on to the payment. So unless you graze the hand of the officials, which we face all of the problem. But as I mentioned during my presentation there, the procurement law itself, including the international instrument as a GPA, they are one important instrument, but it will not get all the job done. It all depends on how actually procurement law is correlated with all the other legal instruments we have available in our arsenal, and how it has been enforced in practice. And in China, we have perfect laws. The problem is with enforcement. The judiciary sometimes cannot be trustworthy because they are not impartial. They're actually affiliated to the local government and answer to the local party chief. And then how on earth you can guarantee that? Obviously now we are developing kind of a circuit court kind of practice where the Supreme Court is going to send all of the circuit courts to all of the different regions, which is going to change the whole landscape. All right? So as I said, procurement law is one piece of the puzzle, but it's not the whole thing itself. But it is nevertheless very, very important. I mentioned the number of things there. With the GPA, where you have all of the foreign suppliers flooding in, hopefully that will be the case. And then obviously you have all of these extra pair of eyes who is not afraid of being intimidated by the local corrupt official or police force, whoever that is. They can actually challenge all the decisions which they regarded as illegal or inappropriate before the review body. And the review body itself, as provided by the GPA, has to be impartial and subject to judicial review. Obviously, the GPA put a blind faith in the judiciary. They actually regarded the judiciary as an ultimate impartial independent body, which could not be the case actually in a number of countries, including mine. I'm not quite sure about Brazil. So that's the thing. You're going to have to make sure that you keep an eye on your judiciary as well to make sure they are in compliance with the GPA, but the GPA can be used as a momentum and as a particular opportunity to streamline, to entrench the position of the reformers domestically, as I mentioned before. So use that as an opportunity, all right? Not like saying this is kind of one cure for all, but use this as a leverage, as an opportunity and a momentum to start something which is bigger, right? So that is more or less, my observation there. And with regard to the, one thing which Cesar mentioned I didn't, is that's the BOT, PPP, and concessions. Remember that for those kind of contracts, very importantly, you want to attract as many suppliers or service providers as possible. The wider the competition is, the less likely it's going to become rigged, that is, big rigging, and less likely it's become corrupted because you have more people. You keep an eye on this, people will realize the cost for corruption is too high, the risk is too high. Yeah. So then, obviously, for China, for example, we don't even need to offer it because our concession and PPP contracts is open to foreigners already. And then a number of foreign water companies already have holding concession contract in a number of Chinese cities, which I personally are against because they're not doing a good job and charge too much. All right. But then you don't have to include it in annexes, because it's already open. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Bing. Thank you very much. Cesar, I have one question for you. It's related to what you said before about the connection between government and private sector. So I would like to explore this idea a little bit better on the process of accessing. So first, what's the role of the private sector on this process of accession? Is there any kind of thing that the private sector can do, make, foster, engage in order to provide and help out this process? What's its role? Just sit and wait? Or there is another thing the private sector can do to foster this process? Thank you.
Thank you. I think that's a very important issue. We basically, when we joined the GPA seeking to reach other markets, we want to know what our companies want to reach, right? What we think we can provide other countries and where we think we could compete And Ping mentioned aircraft. That could be one area in which Brazil excels, and where we could in these consultations with the private sector identify other areas, food products, for instance, or commodities, and in which our companies would like our government to make an extra effort to obtain advantages in that area in exchange for other things that we have in this negotiation need to offer. So that is why it's so important, and it is already in the radar of private sector associations to think about those issues and to interact with the government in this process of negotiation. I just wanted to make a comment, if I may, about something that Ping mentioned regarding PPPs and concessions. It is also true in Brazil that we have a very open, at least in theory, public procurement market for foreigners. I think in that regard, the greatest gain joining the GPA is that we will be forced to, at least in theory again, but we should be forced to do away with certain traps in hidden difficulties that are not stated in the law, because the law is very open for international bidders, at least in most areas. But then you need some certificates that you can only get if you're Brazilian, or if you can only understand what they are if you're Brazilian. And in that type of restriction is probably something that we will need to overcome if we move on with this process. And that's where we would gain in terms of opening to foreign bidders in a more straightforward, transparent way, an effective way, actually. Yeah. But we do have, especially in infrastructure projects, we do have many international companies that go beyond those hidden difficulties and actually take part in procurement, because after all, Brazil has a very large market. It's probably the 6th largest public procurement market among the WTO members, and so it's a very important market for foreign bidders, and I'm sure a lot of the attention to Brazil's joining the GPA has to do with that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Cesar. I'd like to know if any of you guys have any further consideration or reaction, maybe Astghik, Cesar, about what has been said before, or if we have 2 minutes, if anyone here wants to make final considerations.
I see that Caroline is there, so I just want to say hello to my friend.
All right. So, Caroline, hello from Ping. That's the Brazilian spirit. Great. All right, so
Juliana, I just wanted to just point out very quickly one thing that I think is, from my point of view, is the most important takeaway maybe for the Brazilian government in the process of moving forward, and that is that there is no need to rush, that we need to do things carefully, and that this is a very crucial moment when we take this first stand, and especially with regard to the issue of Article 5 and the qualification of Brazil as a developing country. If that is something important, and that is up to the Brazilian government to reflect upon, this is the moment to do that, because we cannot submit an offer saying based on the statement that we are not a developing country, and then try to say, I don't know, I remembered that I am. So if we have to make a decision about that, it has to be now, and we don't have to rush, That's basically what I wanted to say.
Yeah, that's a good point, because I truly think it's if anybody wants to contest the developing country status, China will be first, and then Brazil will be second.
Oh, great. That's very important, because now on the pandemic world, we have this tension between speed and accuracy. So we're taking bad decisions because we need to speed up. That's precisely the opposite on the GPA issue. Maybe you need to go a little bit slowly in order to foster accuracy, make more fashionable decisions and efficient decisions. So
yeah, you need to take extra care with the first offer, because once you table the first offer, as Cesar mentioned, it's very difficult to retract later on. And then obviously, if you do a very good job at the first offer instead of what China has done, then you will actually do not give much excuse to all the GPA parties to actually table any questions or inquiries. As you've seen the table Cesar showed in his presentation of the Australian, they have a lot of issues which people can ask about. Similarly, if you do a good job with your threshold, with all the covering entities and so on, probably you won't have to. However, that all depends on the power of the negotiator. So to what extent they can actually coordinate all the positions of SOEs, as Cesar mentioned, you have so many, and then people will actually be interested in seeing them included in Annex 3. However, you have to think about what they think. Do they want to be subject to the GPA obligation? I can tell you, in China, that's no small matter. Until as I mentioned, President Xi Jinping's actually intervention in 2018, the Ministry of Finance, the Chinese negotiator, couldn't actually manage any, apart from the two, which is actually financial institution under their supervision. The other one, which is actually the China Post, is because the CEO of the Post is actually a friend with the minister. So it's kind of personal link that's working there. It's not a kind of official channels. And then use the momentum from the top leadership. Then you can issue a questionnaire and issue actually request for all of the SOEs to sign up. That is actually when they affiliate to the local government. You will realize that the Chinese offer does not cover any actually centrally affiliated enterprise, apart from one probably. But then those are the ones which is really powerful. You have some of them as well affiliated to the federal government, and then they have quasi-ministerial status, and then it's very difficult for any minister to tell them what to do or what's not. And some of the Chinese enterprises affiliated to the central government, they're actually in the Fortune 500. So it will be odd to say, okay, all the small enterprises are covered, but not the big ones, right? So that kind of question will be anticipated. And then what kind of derogation you need? So do you have SME protection? Sometimes these issues, as Cesar mentioned, can be actually resolved from use other techniques, like if you have a really high threshold, for example, the majority of the contract which SME is really interested in will be excluded from the coverage anyway, so there won't be a problem, right? So you need to check that SOEs are happy. And SOEs, remember, you have to differentiate the treatment between small and micro enterprises and the medium enterprise on the other. I think the majority of the concern is actually with regard to the treatment of the medium-sized enterprise instead of small and micro ones. Okay.
Yeah, great. So we need to make this process work and take decisions in an informed basis. At this panel was extremely rewarding, extremely thoughtful to consider how to shape this process. We don't need to hurry. We need to collect the data. We need to know better Brazil. We need to learn from insightful experiences, such as Chinese experience. We need to have, let me say on this perspective, we need to know better the academic debate out of Brazil in order to anticipate the correct questions, and therefore we maybe be ready to not only foster this process, but gain confidence, gain trust on this process. At least in Brazil, I think one of the primary issues is to gain trust on this process. At least now we have this terrible environment which everyone does not trust anybody. So to foster confidence is extremely important for this process, including to foster institutions to engage on this process. So we need to make this one Brazilian project. And by now we have some sort of interest, but it's not precisely one Brazilian process.
Yeah,
Thank
and
you.
also you have your own characteristics with regards to the electronic procurement. So the electronic procurement can be very useful in this process, in terms of data gathering, but also in the future compliance, because if you have one gateway, then you can use this as a gateway for the GPA accession and GPA compliance. But then it has to be translated or into Spanish or into English, because Portuguese is not one of the 4 official language recognized by the WTO, by the GPA. So you're going to have to do all the translation work. But obviously, the detail can be actually accessed through other language platforms. But that is actually one challenge.
Perfect. Maybe that's one problem. Another problem. The problem is it's a characteristic in Brazil, but maybe it's a problem. We have a lot of peculiarities. So, for example, the process, but also I was talking about this oversight body. So in Brazil, we have a completely different aspect of these bodies controlling public procurement. We have extremely intense control of accounting offices. So it's something important to see, because maybe we can check this specific part on the process, as Astghik said before, but what kind of oversight body GPA is considered, and what kind of oversight body we have in Brazil, and what are our dynamics? Maybe we need to adjust with this, and it's going to cause a lot of tensions, domestic tensions.
As I said, GPA is actually flexible. GPA is only a ceiling, only a floor. It's not a ceiling. So it's actually, as long as you regard it as independent and impartial, that's fine. It doesn't matter. Sometimes, like in other countries, like in Hong Kong, like even in the US, they're actually reviewable. They can only issue recommendations. They don't even issue kind of binding ruling. But that is enough for the GPA. But then, as I said, you can use this as a as a leverage, a momentum, a starting point, and then try to achieve something bigger. Use it as an opportunity. So for the review body, obviously, that's definitely one of the point. Like in the US, it's the GAO, the general, it's audit office, but it's called the Government Accountability Office, affiliated to the Parliament. So even if it issue recommendation only, but it's very difficult to see that the government won't follow that. But then in your country, if you say you have very kind of strict accounting office, that is the audit office, I understand. But then it is not similarly an administrative review body. Do they have lawyers in it? That's the thing. The GAO has employed a lot of lawyers, and they're very, very efficient and professional in terms of handling all of the complaints. Or they can surround all of the frivolous ones very quickly. So can you do the same? And in China, for example, we have the Ministry of Finance, which is they have their own team handling all of the complaints, although a different department, but still under the same roof. So their impartiality, independence is actually quite often questionable, because you all answer to the same boss, right? So to what extent they will actually to say, okay, the procurement is done badly because we have done it.
That's very important. So basically, in the end, we are talking about country's reputation, and you need to use the best way as possible. All right, guys, I would be discussing with you all for a long time during to end this panel. It was an extremely interesting, extremely thoughtful panel. Thank you very much, Astghik, Ping. Thank you very much for IPP to host the panel, and also University of Nottingham. Thank you very much, guys.
Okay.
Thank you.
Ciao, ciao.
Ciao, ciao. Thank you.
Ciao, ciao.
Thank you. Bye, ciao.